I'm Rebecca Hamilton, 34, and I still remember the exact moment my world imploded. Standing in our mansion's marble foyer, designer suitcases at my feet, my husband of 8 years, James, towered over me with a cold smile. "Without me, you'll be nothing again," he sneered, waving his platinum credit card. "6 months and you'll come crawling back." That was 3 years ago. Yesterday, I signed the final papers making me CEO of a $50 million company, the same day his bankruptcy was announced. He doesn't know I'm his largest creditor. If you've ever had someone underestimate you so completely that it fueled your entire comeback story, I'd love to hear where you're watching from today. This journey taught me that family betrayal cuts deepest, but also creates the strongest motivation for success. Hit that subscribe button if you've ever wanted to prove someone wrong who said you couldn't make it on your own, and let's dive into how I went from desperate housewife to CEO. When I met James at 26, I was a struggling interior designer with big dreams but an empty bank account. Fresh out of design school with student loans weighing me down, I was working 70-hour weeks trying to build a client base in the competitive New York market. My tiny studio apartment doubled as my office, and ramen was a luxury compared to the plain pasta I usually ate. James walked into the model home I had designed for a small developer, one of my first real projects. He wasn't supposed to be there, he was filling in for his father at the last minute to evaluate the property for potential acquisition. When our eyes met across that staged living room, I felt like I was in a movie. At 34, James was already a vice president at Hamilton Developments, his family's third-generation real estate empire. He was tall, impeccably dressed, and carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who had never worried about money. "This design work is interesting," he said, running his fingers along the custom shelving I'd installed on a shoestring budget. "Who's responsible?" When I stepped forward, his eyebrows raised slightly, whether from surprise at my youth or my clearly non-designer outfit of department store slacks and a blouse, I couldn't tell. "I'd like to discuss some possibilities for our newest development," he said, handing me a business card so heavy and textured it felt like a status symbol in my hand. "Perhaps over dinner?" Our courtship was a whirlwind that swept me off my feet and into a world I'd only seen in magazines. Private jets to Paris for weekend shopping. A summer house in the Hamptons. Galas where I rubbed shoulders with celebrities while wearing jewelry that cost more than my parents' house. I was dizzying, intoxicating, and completely overwhelming. My middle-class upbringing in Pennsylvania hadn't prepared me for this life. My father was a high school teacher, my mother a nurse. I was the first in my family to graduate college, doing so with honors and enormous debt. They were proud but bewildered by my entrance into James' world. "Just be careful, Becky," my father said during one of our increasingly rare phone calls. "People like that, they play by different rules." But I was too enchanted to listen. 8 months after meeting, James proposed at 11 Madison Park with a diamond so large I was embarrassed to wear it in public. Our wedding was featured in Town and Country, a 3-day affair for 350 guests, most of whom I'd never met. "Just sign here, darling," James said the day before our wedding, sliding a thick document across the table. "Just formalities. My family insists on a prenup for all marriages." My parents looked concerned, but I signed without reading it fully. What did it matter? We were in love. This was forever. The early years of our marriage seemed perfect, at least from the outside. We traveled extensively, attended the right events, and were photographed for social pages looking like the ideal couple. James began grooming me to be the perfect corporate wife. My wardrobe was replaced piece by piece with designer brands selected by the personal shopper he hired. My Pennsylvania accent was gently but persistently corrected. Even my hair color was professionally maintained to the exact shade he preferred. "You're representing the Hamilton name now," he would remind me. "Appearance matters." Gradually, my own design career faded into the background. At first, it was because James needed me at important business dinners. Then it was because maintaining our social obligations was practically a full-time job. Soon, I was working unpaid at his company, helping out by redesigning their corporate headquarters and staging their model units. You don't need your own clients anymore, James insisted when I mentioned missing my work. Besides, your little business was barely breaking even. Now you get to play with real budgets. My separate bank account dwindled as I stopped earning my own income. James set up a household account for me with a generous monthly allowance, but I had to explain any unusual expenses. Meanwhile, I had no visibility into our overall finances. Those were too complicated for me to understand, according to James. The isolation happened so gradually I barely noticed. First, it was harder to meet my old friends because they couldn't afford the restaurants James preferred. Then my college roommate Caitlin was no longer welcome at our house after she questioned why I always deferred to James' opinions. My weekly calls with my parents became monthly, then quarterly, as I became embarrassed about the growing distance between our lives. Instead, I was surrounded by James' friends and their wives, women who talked about charity boards and household staff while the men discussed business deals. I learned to smile and nod, to ask the right questions about their children and vacation homes, to never mention anything substantive or controversial. The wives were talking about starting a book club, James told me after one dinner party. Wouldn't that be fun for you? It wasn't a question. The next day I was added to a group text for the Westchester Literary Ladies, whose reading selections were invariably light beach reads or inspirational memoirs. The first clear warning sign came 3 years into our marriage. I had used my contacts from design school to help secure a prime Manhattan location for one of James' projects. At the celebration dinner, I mentioned my contribution to the company's CFO. In the car afterward, James was furious. Never try to take credit for business matters you don't understand, he hissed. You embarrassed me. You're my wife, not my colleague. That night, I cried myself to sleep while he worked late in his home office. The next morning, a Tiffany bracelet was on my pillow, no note, no apology. I wore it as instructed to a charity luncheon that afternoon. The pattern continued for years. Any show of independence or questioning was met with cold anger, followed by expensive gifts and perhaps a trip to a luxury spa to relax. James would remind me how lucky I was, how many women would kill to have my life, how I'd been nothing before he found me. And over time, I started to believe him. The text message that changed everything wasn't even meant for me. James had left his phone on our bathroom counter while showering, and when it lit up with a notification, I glanced at it without thinking. Can't wait to feel you inside me again. Meeting at the usual spot tomorrow? Melissa. My hands trembled as I picked up the phone. This had to be a mistake. James was many things, controlling, dismissive, condescending, but unfaithful? I'd never suspected. The passcode was my birthday, and it took only minutes to find hundreds of messages between them. Melissa was his executive assistant, a sleek blonde who always seemed politely distant at company functions. The affair had been going on for at least a year, judging by the messages. They met at hotels, at her apartment, sometimes even in his office after hours. I put the phone back exactly where I'd found it and walked to our bedroom in a daze. Part of me wanted to confront him immediately, to scream and throw things, but a deeper instinct held me back. This required strategy. For 2 weeks, I gathered evidence, taking photos of his texts when possible, noting his late meetings, checking credit card statements for hotel charges and jewelry purchases that had never made their way to me. All while maintaining our normal routines and smiling through charity galas and dinner parties. When I finally confronted him, we were having breakfast on our terrace overlooking the manicured gardens. I know about Melissa, I said calmly, sliding my phone with the photos of his text messages across the table. James barely glanced at the screen before looking up at me with irritation rather than guilt. This is why I don't let you handle business matters, he said, setting down his coffee. You're far too emotional. Melissa is a valuable employee who understands her role. Her role as your mistress? My voice cracked despite my determination to stay composed. Don't be so provincial, Rebecca. Successful men have certain arrangements. It doesn't affect our marriage. It affects me, I said, my voice rising. This is humiliating. Everyone probably knows. James laughed, actually laughed, and the sound was like ice water in my veins. No one cares, darling. The other wives understand how this works. Why do you think Caroline always brings her personal trainer to the Hamptons? Or why Thomas and Elizabeth have separate bedrooms? He reached for my hand. You're being paranoid. Maybe you should talk to Dr. Phillips about adjusting your medication. I wasn't on any medication. This casual gaslighting, implying I was mentally unstable whenever I challenged him, was a tactic I'd grown familiar with over the years. But this time it didn't work. I want a divorce, I said quietly. James' expression darkened. Don't be ridiculous. You signed a prenup. You'll get nothing. I don't care about the money. Of course you do. His tone was almost pitying now. What would you even do? Your little design career is long gone. You have no recent work experience. You'd be starting over at 34 with nothing. I'd rather have nothing than this, I replied, standing up from the table. I thought that would be the end of the conversation, that we'd separate with some dignity and negotiate terms through lawyers. I was wrong. That evening, I returned from a long walk to find my credit cards cut up on our bed. My cell phone service had been disconnected. The locks on our home office, where our financial documents were kept, had been changed. This is how it's going to be, James said, watching from the doorway as I stared at the destroyed cards. You want a divorce? Fine. But remember what you signed. You get your personal belongings and nothing else. The next 2 weeks were a blur of attempts to find a lawyer who would take my case with minimal upfront fees, all while living in increasingly hostile conditions. James brought Melissa to our home one evening, introducing her to the household staff as the new Mrs. Hamilton, in training. The final straw came during a company cocktail party we hosted at our home. I had dutifully played hostess, smiling through the pitying glances from those who clearly knew about Melissa. Exhausted, I went looking for James to tell him I was retiring for the evening. I found them in his office, Melissa perched on his desk, her skirt hiked up, James standing between her legs. They didn't even stop when I opened the door. Could you close that on your way out? James said, not bothering to turn around. We're in the middle of something. The next morning, I packed my designer clothes into 3 suitcases, all I could manage on my own. As I stood in the foyer waiting for the Uber that would take me to a hotel until I figured out my next steps, James appeared at the top of the grand staircase. 6 months, he said with that cold smile. That's how long it will take before you come crawling back, begging me to take you in again. Without me, you're nothing. You always were. He descended the stairs and held out his platinum credit card, waving it tauntingly. Last chance. Stay, and we forget this little tantrum. I walked out the door without looking back. It was only later that night, alone in a sterile hotel room paid for with the emergency cash I kept hidden in my jewelry box, that I allowed myself to cry. The next day, I learned James had already begun divorce proceedings, claiming I had abandoned our home and was mentally unstable. He'd frozen all accounts I might have access to, cancelled insurance policies, and even contacted our social circle to share his concern about my breakdown. With nowhere else to go, I called the one person I hoped might still be on my side, Caitlin, my college roommate whom James had banished years ago. Despite our lack of contact, she immediately offered her spare bedroom in her small Brooklyn apartment. Stay as long as you need, she said, helping me carry my suitcases up 3 flights of stairs. We'll figure this out. I spent that first night on her lumpy futon, staring at the ceiling and wondering if James was right. Maybe I couldn't make it without him. Maybe I was nothing. Table 7 needs water refills, and 12 is ready to order. 3 months after leaving James, I was waitressing at a bistro in Chelsea, working double shifts to save for a security deposit on my own apartment. My designer clothes had been consigned to pay for a used laptop and business attire suitable for job interviews. So far, those interviews had gone nowhere. My resume showed a glaring 8-year gap, and James had been thorough in blackballing me among our former social connections. The divorce proceedings dragged on, with James' high-powered legal team filing motion after motion to delay and complicate matters. My lawyer, Jessica, had taken my case at a reduced rate after hearing my story, but even she was growing frustrated by their tactics. "They're trying to drain your resources," she explained during one of our meetings. "It's a common strategy when there's a significant power imbalance." I came home after each 12-hour shift with aching feet and dwindling hope, yet something kept me from calling James and admitting defeat. Perhaps it was stubbornness, or perhaps it was the memory of that cold smile when he predicted my failure. The turning point came on a rainy Tuesday when I was serving the lunch crowd. A woman sitting alone at a window table looked vaguely familiar, and when I approached to take her order, her eyes widened in recognition. "Rebecca? Rebecca Lewis from Chelsea Designs?" It took me a moment to place her, Eleanor Blackwell, a wealthy client from my early design days. I had renovated her Manhattan Pide Terrace 6 years earlier, before marriage to James had consumed my identity. "It's Hamilton now," I said automatically, then corrected myself. "Actually, I'm going back to Lewis." "Join me," she insisted, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. "Unless you're too busy?" I glanced at my manager, who nodded permission. Eleanor was known as a generous tipper. Over the next hour, as the lunch rush subsided, I gave Eleanor the condensed version of my situation. She listened without interruption, her expression growing increasingly indignant. "So this bastard essentially stole 8 years of your career, isolated you from your support system, and now thinks he can discard you with nothing," she summarized. Put so bluntly, it sounded even worse than I'd allowed myself to acknowledge. "I remember your work, Rebecca. That apartment you designed for me still gets compliments. I've never found another designer with your eye for balancing modern elements with traditional architecture." She reached into her purse and extracted a business card. "I've just purchased a vacation home in the Hamptons that needs a complete overhaul. The previous owners had abysmal taste. Would you be interested in taking on the project?" I stared at her, certain I'd misheard. I don't even have a business license anymore. Or a portfolio. Or suppliers. Details, she waved dismissively. "I can connect you with my attorney to sort out the paperwork, and I have a rather extensive network that might be useful. As for portfolio, I've kept photos of my apartment, and I seem to recall a feature in Architectural Digest." That night, I sat at Caitlin's kitchen table with Eleanor's check for the project deposit in front of me. It was enough to rent a small studio apartment and re-establish my business. A lifeline I hadn't dared hope for. "You're really doing this," Caitlin said, pouring us each a glass of cheap wine in celebration. "I'm really doing this," I agreed, and for the first time since leaving James, I felt something like hope. The Eleanor project became my obsession. I worked on it during the day and continued waitressing at night, pouring every penny of profit back into rebuilding my design business. I registered Rebecca Lewis Design, created a simple website, and began the painstaking process of reconnecting with vendors and craftspeople I'd known before my marriage. To my surprise, many remembered me fondly and were willing to work with me again, some even extending credit terms that helped with cash flow. "We always wondered what happened to you," one cabinetmaker told me. "Figured that fancy husband made you quit." Eleanor, true to her word, introduced me to her extensive social circle. At first, I was just Eleanor's designer, standing awkwardly at gatherings with people who vacationed in the same exclusive locations as James and I once had. But gradually, as the Hamptons project progressed and photos began circulating, I started receiving inquiries from Eleanor's friends. 6 months after our chance meeting, Eleanor hosted a lavish housewarming party at her renovated home. The guest list included magazine editors, real estate developers, and social figures whose names I recognized from my former life. This time, though, I wasn't James' decorative accessory, I was the talented designer everyone wanted to meet. During that party, I overheard a conversation that sent ice through my veins. "Hamilton Developments is leveraged to the hilt," a silver-haired man was saying to his companion. "James has been using client deposits to fund ongoing projects. Classic Ponzi setup." "Not surprised," his friend replied. Old man Hamilton would never have approved. Too bad the son doesn't have half the business sense of his father. I moved closer, pretending to adjust a flower arrangement. SEC's been asking questions, the first man continued. Word is, several investors are considering pulling out. That night, I couldn't sleep. If James' business was in trouble, it might explain his increasingly desperate attempts to minimize my divorce settlement. More importantly, it meant the company where I'd spent years working without compensation or recognition might have records of my contributions, records that could potentially strengthen my position. The next morning, I powered up my old laptop, the one personal device James hadn't managed to confiscate. To my shock, my login credentials for the Hamilton development server still worked. Apparently, IT had never received instructions to revoke my access. What I found made my hands shake. Project files containing my design work, presented as if created by the official design department. Emails discussing Rebecca's contribution to landing key clients and securing properties. And most damning of all, financial records showing irregular movement of funds between projects in exactly the pattern the men at the party had described. I called Jessica immediately. I think I've found something that changes everything. The frosted glass door was delivered on a Tuesday morning, the final touch to my small commercial space in a converted warehouse in Brooklyn's Dumbo neighborhood. As the installers carefully positioned it, I watched my company name appear letter by letter, Hamilton Designs. Yes, Hamilton. Not because I couldn't let go of James, but because the name recognition gave me a foot in the door with potential clients. My lawyer had confirmed that since I was still legally Rebecca Hamilton until the divorce was finalized, I had every right to use the name professionally. It was petty, perhaps, but deeply satisfying. The evidence I'd discovered on the Hamilton development server had indeed changed everything. Jessica had used it to negotiate a much more favorable divorce settlement, not the fortune James controlled, but enough to lease this small office space and hire my first employee. Marcus Chen was a recent graduate from Pratt Institute with extraordinary computer rendering skills and a portfolio that showed genuine talent. He'd applied to every major design firm in New York with no success, likely due to the same subtle discrimination I'd faced early in my career. Why me? I asked during his interview. This is barely a company yet. Because your work doesn't look like everyone else's, he said simply. All those other firms, they do the same sterile luxury look. Your designs have soul. With Marcus handling technical drawings and 3D visualizations, I could focus on client relationships and creative direction. Eleanor continued to be my champion, hosting a small gathering to introduce me to friends who might need design services. Rebecca approaches luxury differently, she told the assembled guests in her Hamptons living room. Look around, nothing here is ostentatious, yet everything is exquisite. She understands that true wealth whispers, it doesn't shout. That afternoon, I booked 3 new clients, including a tech entrepreneur who had recently purchased a historic Brooklyn brownstone. I want something that respects the building's history but doesn't feel like a museum, Julian Mercer explained during our first meeting. Everyone kept showing me concepts that looked like a spread from Architectural Digest, all white and chrome. Then I saw Eleanor's place. The brownstone project consumed the next 3 months. Working with a tight timeline and challenging structural constraints, I pushed myself harder than ever before. When construction revealed original features hidden by previous renovations, I revised plans overnight to incorporate them. When custom furnishings arrived damaged, I personally drove to workshops in New Jersey to expedite replacements. You never worked this hard for Hamilton developments, Marcus observed one night as we finalized details at 2 a.m. Because it wasn't mine, I replied simply. When the project was complete, Julian was so impressed he convinced the editor of Architectural Digest to feature it. The irony wasn't lost on me. The magazine I'd once proudly displayed on my coffee table as James' wife now showcased my independent work. The article went viral in design circles, highlighting our approach of conscious luxury that prioritized craftsmanship and sustainability over ostentation. My phone began ringing constantly. Marcus and I were suddenly drowning in inquiries. We need help, I admitted after a week of working until midnight. I think it's time to expand. By our 6-month anniversary, Hamilton Designs had grown to 5 employees working in our increasingly cramped Brooklyn office. In addition to Marcus, I'd hired Zoe, a brilliant space planner, Tanner, who specialized in sustainable material sourcing, and twin sisters Amara and Anika, recent design school graduates who shared an administrative role while learning the business. The rapid growth forced me to confront how little I knew about actually running a company. James had always handled, or controlled, our finances, and I'd never been allowed meaningful involvement in business operations at Hamilton Developments. There's a night business program at NYU, Caitlin suggested during one of our now weekly dinners. She'd become not just my friend again but a crucial emotional support. Mini MBA for entrepreneurs. Might be worth checking out. I enrolled the following week, spending my evenings learning accounting principles, marketing strategies, and human resources management. The classes were exhausting after full workdays, but each new concept felt like reclaiming another piece of myself that James had suppressed. The professor of my finance class, Dr. Eliza Rivera, pulled me aside after a particularly challenging session on cash flow projections. "You have a natural aptitude for this," she said. "Most creative types struggle with the quantitative material, but you seem to grasp it intuitively." I laughed. "Don't tell that to my ex-husband. He spent years convincing me I was too emotional and scattered to understand business." Dr. Rivera's expression hardened. Classic manipulation tactic. Undermine someone's confidence in their abilities, and you control them. During our midterm project, when we had to create a comprehensive business plan, I focused on a concept that had been forming in my mind, expanding Hamilton Designs beyond interiors into full property development, specializing in sustainable urban rehabilitation projects. "This is ambitious," Dr. Rivera commented when I presented the plan. "But the market analysis is sound. Have you considered seeking investors?" I hadn't. The idea of pitching to investors still seemed beyond my capabilities. But the seed was planted. Around this time, Eleanor introduced me to her friend Margaret Wu, a successful entrepreneur who had recently sold her tech company and was looking for new investment opportunities. "Eleanor won't stop talking about your work," Margaret said over lunch. "But I'm more interested in your business model. Sustainable luxury is an underserved niche with significant growth potential." By the end of our meal, Margaret had offered to invest in Hamilton Designs in exchange for a 20% stake, with the specific goal of expanding into development projects. The terms were fair, the funding substantial, and most importantly, she explicitly valued my creative direction and leadership. "I invest in people, not just businesses," she explained. "And I like your story, Rebecca. You've got something to prove, and that kind of motivation is priceless." With Margaret's investment, we moved to larger offices in a converted factory building in Long Island City. I hired an operations manager, a financial controller, and 3 more designers. The About Us page on our website now showed a team of 12 talented professionals, a far cry from the desperate woman who had fled her marriage with 3 suitcases. Our first major development opportunity came through Julian Mercer, who had purchased an abandoned warehouse in Red Hook with plans for conversion to mixed-use space. "The other developers I talked to want to maximize luxury condos and minimize everything else," he explained. "I want something different: affordable housing, workspaces for artists, community areas. Can Hamilton Designs handle something like this?" It was a bigger project than anything we'd done before, with complex zoning, financing, and construction challenges. It was also exactly the direction I wanted to take the company. "We can handle it," I said confidently, thinking of all those nights studying business models and financial projections. In fact, this is precisely where we're heading. As I signed the contract for our largest project to date, my phone buzzed with a news alert: Hamilton Developments faces investor lawsuit amid financial irregularities. I allowed myself a small smile before turning back to Julian to discuss our vision for transforming not just a building, but an entire neighborhood. If you've ever had to completely reinvent yourself after hitting rock bottom, you know how terrifying those first steps are. Each small victory feels monumental when you're rebuilding from nothing. Drop a comment below sharing your own comeback story, big or small, and hit subscribe if you want to hear how I turned these first successes into an empire that would make my ex-husband's jaw drop. The email arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning, sent from an address I didn't recognize. Ms. Lewis, I believe we have common interests regarding Hamilton developments. Coffee? It was signed simply Tyler Martin, former assistant to CFO. I vaguely remembered Tyler, a quiet, efficient young man who had always been polite to me during my time as James' wife. Unlike many at the company, he had never treated me as merely decorative. We met at a small cafe far from the financial district, where the likelihood of running into anyone from Hamilton Developments was minimal. Tyler arrived precisely on time, looking both nervous and determined. "Thank you for meeting me," he said, fidgeting with his coffee cup. "I've been following your success with Hamilton Designs. Impressive pivot." "Thank you. But I suspect you didn't reach out to discuss my design business." Tyler glanced around before leaning forward. "I was fired 6 months ago for questioning accounting practices. Officially, I was let go for poor performance, but it happened the day after I asked the CFO about discrepancies in project funding allocations." My heart beat faster. "The same issues I found evidence of before leaving?" "Probably. But it's gotten worse." Tyler pulled out a thumb drive and slid it across the table. "I kept documentation. Not just the Ponzi scheme with client deposits, but fake invoices, shell companies, inflated valuations. Classic fraud playbook. Why bring this to me?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "2 reasons. First, you were always decent to me, unlike most of the Hamilton family. Second, rumor has it you're still fighting for a fair divorce settlement. This might help." I studied his face. "And what do you want in return?" "Nothing immediately. Maybe a job reference someday. Maybe the satisfaction of seeing James face consequences." Tyler stood to leave. "Just be careful. James has powerful friends." That night, I reviewed the files Tyler had provided. The scope of financial misconduct was staggering, far beyond what I had initially discovered. James wasn't just using new client deposits to fund ongoing projects, he was falsifying financial statements, creating phantom expenses, and diverting company funds for personal use. Most disturbing was a folder labeled RH Contingencies, which contained detailed plans for ensuring I received minimal assets in our divorce. It included communications with private investigators hired to follow me, strategies for portraying me as mentally unstable, and discussions about fabricating evidence of infidelity on my part. I called Jessica immediately, my hands shaking. "We need to be strategic about this," my lawyer cautioned after reviewing the files. "These documents were obtained without authorization. We can't simply present them in court. So what do? We use the information to guide our investigation through legal channels. And we consider whether to involve regulatory authorities." The ethical dilemma kept me awake that night. Reporting James to the SEC would likely destroy Hamilton Developments completely. Despite my anger toward James, the company employed hundreds of people who had nothing to do with his misconduct. Did I want that collateral damage on my conscience? Was revenge worth the cost to innocent employees? After days of deliberation, I made a decision. I wouldn't file an SEC complaint, yet. Instead, I would use the information to strengthen my position in the divorce and to protect myself from James' attempts to undermine me. With Jessica's guidance, I hired Rajiv Patel, a forensic financial investigator who specialized in high-conflict divorces. Using the roadmap provided by Tyler's files, Rajiv identified legally obtainable evidence of James' financial misconduct that could be presented in court. "He's been systematically hiding assets," Rajiv explained during one of our meetings. "Offshore accounts, properties purchased through shell companies, consulting fees paid to non-existent advisors. Classic divorce playbook for the unethical wealthy. Can we prove it's deliberate?" "Some of it. Enough to convince a judge to order more comprehensive financial disclosure." our strategy worked. When confronted with evidence of hidden assets, James' lawyers suddenly became more amenable to settlement discussions. The divorce proceedings that had been dragging on for over a year accelerated rapidly. Meanwhile, I was learning that intelligence gathering worked both ways. Through casual conversations with Eleanor and other contacts in real estate circles, I began identifying properties that Hamilton Developments had passed on, parcels of land or buildings that James had dismissed as worthless or too problematic. I hired an independent assessor to evaluate several of these properties, focusing particularly on areas where city planning documents, public information, indicated future development or rezoning. This old industrial parcel in Queens, the assessor highlighted during his presentation. Hamilton passed on it last year because of contamination concerns. But the city just approved funding for environmental remediation, and the area is slated for transit expansion. Values will triple within 5 years. Using capital from my growing design business and a small investment consortium organized by Margaret Wu, I began quietly acquiring these overlooked properties through anonymous LLCs. The legal structure ensured James wouldn't know I was the buyer. Consider it strategic asset allocation, my new financial advisor suggested when I questioned whether these moves were too motivated by revenge. You're identifying undervalued properties based on specialized knowledge. That's just good business. Perhaps it was rationalization, but I chose to believe her. After all, I wasn't doing anything illegal. Just using my understanding of James' blind spots and biases to identify opportunities he had missed. As Hamilton Designs continued to grow and my property investments increased in value, I became aware of another form of intelligence that proved valuable: industry gossip. Design clients, particularly wealthy ones, loved to talk about their other properties, investments, and business connections, often revealing information about competitors or market trends they didn't realize was significant. During one client dinner, I learned that a major bank was quietly reducing its exposure to luxury real estate developers, including Hamilton Developments. From another client, I heard that the general contractor James typically used was facing litigation for cutting corners on structural elements. Each piece of information formed part of a larger picture of a company in increasing trouble. I began maintaining a detailed file of my own, not for revenge, but for protection. If Hamilton Developments collapsed, I needed to ensure I wouldn't be collaterally damaged by association, particularly since I still carried the Hamilton name professionally. Through strategic investments in distressed debt markets, I also began acquiring portions of Hamilton Developments' outstanding loans that nervous banks were eager to offload. These purchases were made through several layers of shell companies, ensuring that neither James nor his financial team would realize who now held their debt obligations. "You're becoming quite the financial strategist," Margaret observed during one of our regular business reviews. "For someone supposedly too emotional to understand business, you've got remarkably good instincts." I smiled, thinking of all those nights James had patronizingly explained basic business concepts to me as if I were a child. I had a good teacher, just not the one he thinks. As our divorce settlement finally neared completion, with terms far more favorable than James had initially offered, I received another email from Tyler Martin. FYI, JH liquidating personal assets quickly. Unusual movement in corporate accounts. Something big happening. Be prepared. The next day, the first news reports appeared questioning Hamilton Developments' financial stability after several high-profile investors publicly withdrew from projects. The company's stock, which had been gradually declining for months, dropped 15% in a single day. I watched from my office as financial commentators speculated about the company's future. On my desk sat the divorce settlement, finally ready for signatures. The timing couldn't have been more perfect, or more suspicious. "Do you think James knows his company is in trouble?" Jessica asked as we reviewed the final documents. "He knows," I replied confidently. "That's why he finally agreed to these terms. He wants this closed before things get worse." "Are you going to tell him about your property acquisitions? Or the debt you control?" I thought about it for a moment, remembering James standing in our foyer, predicting my failure. "Not yet," I said. Let's just say I'm planning a surprise reunion. Happy 2-year anniversary, everyone. I raised my champagne glass to the 25 people gathered in our expanded offices, now occupying an entire floor of the converted factory building. The Hamilton Designs logo, my own handwriting stylized into an elegant mark, dominated the exposed brick wall behind me. When I started this company, I was working from a friend's spare bedroom with nothing but determination and stubbornness, I continued. Today, we're one of the fastest growing design and development firms in New York, with projects spanning 3 states. That's because of all of you. The applause was genuine. We'd built a team that felt more like family than employees. Unlike the cutthroat environment at Hamilton Developments, our culture emphasized collaboration, work-life balance, and shared success. The past year had been transformative. With the divorce finally settled, and with far better terms than James had initially offered, I had officially incorporated Hamilton Development Group as a separate entity from Hamilton Designs. While the design firm continued creating beautiful interiors for private clients, HDG focused on larger-scale projects with a social conscience, converting abandoned factories into affordable housing with integrated community spaces, rehabilitating historic buildings with sustainable technologies, developing mixed-use properties that prioritized local businesses over chain stores. Our flagship project, the conversion of the Red Hook warehouse with Julian Mercer, had received national attention for its innovative approach. Instead of luxury condos, we'd created a vibrant ecosystem of affordable housing, artist studios, co-working spaces, and a public market featuring local food entrepreneurs. You've completely reimagined what development can be, the mayor had said at the ribbon-cutting ceremony. This is the future of urban renewal. What made me proudest wasn't the press coverage or industry awards, but the community's response. Residents formed a neighborhood association, started a community garden on the rooftop, and launched a mentorship program connecting established artists with local youth. The building wasn't just housing people, it was creating community. The success of the Red Hook project brought new opportunities and investors. Margaret Wu introduced me to the partners of Horizon Ventures, a women-led venture capital firm specializing in businesses with social impact. We've been watching your work, Serena Kim, Horizon's founding partner, told me during our first meeting. You're demonstrating that ethical development can also be profitable. That's our sweet spot. Their investment of $20 million allowed Hamilton Development Group to expand into Philadelphia and Boston, cities with similar urban renewal challenges and opportunities as New York. We hired local teams in each location, ensuring our projects reflected community needs rather than imposing New York solutions on different environments. My personal life was evolving too. After 2 years of focusing exclusively on rebuilding my career and financial independence, I had cautiously begun dating again. Aaron Mitchell, an urban economist I'd met during a panel discussion on affordable housing, had pursued me with patient persistence. I understand trust issues, he said during our 3rd dinner together. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. Unlike James, Aaron respected my work and ambition. He asked thoughtful questions about my projects, offered insights without being condescending, and seemed genuinely proud of my accomplishments. It was a novel experience to be with someone who saw my success as attractive rather than threatening. As Hamilton Designs and Hamilton Development Group grew, I remained vigilant about maintaining different values than my former husband had instilled at his company. We implemented profit sharing for all employees after 1 year of employment. We offered generous parental leave regardless of gender. We prioritized hiring people from diverse backgrounds and creating genuinely inclusive work environments. You're building something special here, Eleanor told me during a visit to our offices. Not just successful, but meaningful. The contrast with Hamilton Developments couldn't have been starker. While my companies thrived, James' empire continued its slow collapse. The stock had lost 60% of its value over 18 months. Projects were stalled or abandoned mid-construction. Lawsuits from investors and contractors multiplied. Through carefully structured investments, I had continued acquiring Hamilton Development's debt as nervous creditors sold it at steep discounts. By the 2-year anniversary of my company, I controlled enough to significantly influence the outcome if James defaulted, which financial analysts increasingly predicted was inevitable. I kept this information closely held, sharing it only with my most trusted advisors. It wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about being strategically positioned when opportunities arose from the collapse. The moment that truly marked my transformation came unexpectedly during a financial review meeting. My CFO, Daphne Chen, who I'd hired away from a major investment bank, was walking me through our quarterly performance. "Bottom line, your net worth now exceeds what it was during your marriage," she concluded, sliding a summary document across the table. "And unlike then, these assets are entirely under your control." I stared at the figure, momentarily speechless. I had focused so intently on building something meaningful that I hadn't fully processed how financially successful we'd become. The scared woman who had left her marriage with 3 suitcases now led companies valued at over $30 million. "Should we update your personal financial plans accordingly?" Daphne asked. I nodded, still processing. "Yes, and I think it's time to implement that expansion strategy we've been discussing for HDG." That afternoon, I called a meeting with my executive team to outline our most ambitious plan yet, a nationwide initiative to partner with cities on revitalizing abandoned industrial areas with our model of integrated, sustainable development. The Hamilton approach, as we'd started calling it, would be scaled across the country. As we prepared to announce this expansion, news broke that shook the New York real estate world. Hamilton Developments had defaulted on major loan obligations, and creditors were beginning enforcement actions. James' company was officially in financial free fall. That same evening, I received a surprising LinkedIn message from James' current fiancée, Melissa, the same woman he'd been having an affair with during our marriage. Now styled as a real estate executive, though I knew she had no actual experience, she was clearly hedging her bets. "I've always admired your design aesthetic," her message read. "Perhaps we could discuss potential collaboration opportunities?" I deleted it without responding, but the irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who had helped destroy my marriage now saw me as a lifeboat as James' ship sank. The next morning, I instructed my financial team to prepare for the end game. It was time to reveal myself as the holder of significant Hamilton Developments debt and position for whatever came next. "Are you sure?" Margaret asked when I shared my plans. "This will make the conflict with James very public." "I'm sure," I replied. "I've been hiding in plain sight long enough." The notification letter was sent that afternoon. Hamilton Assets LLC, my holding company, was calling in loans totaling $12 million, payable within 30 days as specified in the loan covenants. It was the beginning of the end for Hamilton Developments, and James had no idea I was the one holding the guillotine cord. The Metropolitan Museum's annual gala for urban preservation was the last place I expected to encounter James, given his company's very public struggles. Yet there he was across the Grand Hall, still impeccably dressed in a custom tuxedo, still commanding attention from a small circle of remaining loyalists. I had attended at Eleanor's insistence. "You belong in these spaces now, Rebecca," wearing a sleek black gown and simple emerald earrings that had been my first significant jewelry purchase after the divorce. The event program included a feature on Hamilton Design's restoration of a historic Brooklyn firehouse into a community arts center, complete with my photo and biography. "Isn't that your ex?" Aaron murmured, his hand supportive at the small of my back. "Yes," I replied, straightening my shoulders. "Let's get a drink." I felt James' eyes on me as we crossed the room, but I focused on greeting colleagues and accepting congratulations on our latest project. When I finally turned, he was directly behind me. "Rebecca," he said, as if we were merely casual acquaintances. "You look successful." "James. Surprised to see you here, given everything." His smile tightened. "Just a temporary setback. We have restructuring plans in motion." "How interesting." I've been reading about those setbacks in the Wall Street Journal. I kept my tone conversational, aware of nearby ears. Defaulting on loans, investor lawsuits, SEC investigation. Quite the trifecta. "Business is complex," he countered dismissively. Something you never quite grasped. Aaron tensed beside me, but I placed a reassuring hand on his arm. James' condescension no longer had power over me. Actually, I grasp it quite well these days. As I'm sure you've noticed. I nodded toward the event program featuring my company. James' expression shifted, annoyance breaking through his practiced charm. Playing with small projects in Brooklyn is hardly comparable to what I built. Built and destroyed, I added pleasantly. Whereas I'm just getting started. Before he could respond, we were interrupted by the museum director asking me to join her in greeting the mayor, who wanted to discuss our company's community revitalization approach. If you'll excuse me, I said to James. Some of us still have businesses to run. It should have been a satisfying moment, but as I walked away, James caught my arm. We should talk privately, he said, his voice low and urgent. About mutual interests. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him on the museum's terrace 5 minutes later. Aaron offered to come with me, but this was a conversation I needed to have alone. The terrace was quiet, offering a stunning view of Central Park illuminated by the full moon. James stood at the stone balustrade, looking out at the city that had once been his playground. I'll be direct, he said as I approached. I know you're behind Hamilton Assets LLC. I didn't bother denying it. Your financial team should have flagged that months ago. They did. I just couldn't believe you'd be so calculating. He turned to face me. What do you want, Rebecca? Revenge? To see me bankrupt? Originally? Perhaps. I moved beside him at the balustrade, looking out at the park rather than at his face. But I've evolved beyond that. Then why call in the loans now? You know I can't possibly meet those obligations in 30 days. Business is complex, I echoed his earlier dismissal. Something you taught me through negative example. James was silent for a moment before shifting tactics. You look good, Becky. I've missed you. The use of my old nickname, one he knew I hated, was calculated to create false intimacy. I almost laughed at the transparency of his manipulation. How's Melissa? I asked instead. Still checking your texts? His jaw tightened. That situation evolved. We're engaged now. Congratulations. I hope your prenup is solid. Rebecca, James sighed, dropping the charm offensive. Let's be practical. We were good together once. Your company is thriving, mine needs breathing room. There's an obvious solution here. I turned to face him fully. Are you actually suggesting we reconcile because you need my money? I'm suggesting a strategic partnership, he corrected. Your design sensibility, my development experience. Hamilton and Hamilton, back together. For a brief, disorienting moment, I saw that James I had fallen for years ago, confident, charismatic, offering a vision of shared success. Then I remembered standing in our foyer with my suitcases, hearing his prediction of my inevitable failure. Without me, you'll be nothing again, he had sneered. No, I said simply. No? Just like that? James looked genuinely shocked. Do you understand what you're turning down? Perfectly. 6 months, James. That's what you gave me before I'd come crawling back. It's been 3 years, and the only one crawling is you. His expression darkened. You think you've won? You have no idea what I'm capable of when cornered. I still have connections you can't imagine. And I have evidence you can't imagine, I countered. Files, emails, financial records, enough to ensure the SEC investigation becomes a criminal one. I've kept it in reserve, but push me, and I'll use it. It was a bluff, I had evidence, but using it would create collateral damage I wasn't willing to cause. But James didn't know that. You wouldn't, he challenged, though uncertainty flickered in his eyes. Try me. Or we can handle this like business professionals. I'll have my team send over terms tomorrow for restructuring the debt obligations. You can review them with your lawyers. What kind of terms? Ones that protect the company's employees and ongoing projects while requiring your complete departure from management. The Hamilton name continues, just without any actual Hamiltons. James' face flushed with anger. You're trying to force me out of my own family company? No, James. Your fraud and mismanagement did that. I'm offering a path that doesn't end with you in prison. Your choice. I turned to leave, but his next words stopped me. I made you, Rebecca. Everything you know about this business, you learned from me. I looked back at him, feeling oddly calm. No, James. Everything I know about success, I learned despite you. As I walked away, leaving him alone on the terrace, I felt something unexpected, not triumph or satisfaction, but simply peace. The confrontation I had both dreaded and anticipated for years was over, and I had emerged not just unscathed but unshaken. James had lost the power to intimidate me, to make me doubt myself, to define my worth. Whatever happened with Hamilton Developments now, whether James accepted my terms or fought to the bitter end, I was finally free of his influence over my self-perception. Back inside, Aaron was waiting, concern evident in his eyes. Everything okay? He asked as I rejoined him. Better than okay, I replied, taking his hand. Let's enjoy the rest of the evening. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I truly did. Rebecca Lewis, CEO of Hamilton Enterprises, has transformed urban development with her innovative approach to community-centered design. The Forbes feature began, accompanied by a photo of me standing in our signature Red Hook development. The 40 Under 40 recognition was unexpected but validating, not just of my business success, but of the values that drove it. 3 years after walking out of my marriage with nothing but suitcases, I had built Hamilton Enterprises into a $50 million company with operations in 5 U.S. cities and our first international projects underway in Toronto and London. What had begun as Hamilton Designs had evolved into a vertically integrated firm handling everything from initial concept to interior finishes, with sustainability and community impact embedded in every decision. The journey hadn't been without challenges. Scaling rapidly required constant adaptation. Entering new markets meant building relationships from scratch. Maintaining our company culture across multiple offices demanded intentional effort. But each obstacle overcome felt like another step away from the woman James had dismissed as incapable. Our Toronto project, converting a former textile factory into affordable housing with integrated workspaces for artisans, had attracted international attention for its innovative financing model that allowed tenants to build equity through rent payments. The Mayor of London had personally recruited us to bring a similar approach to abandoned industrial sites in East London. You've created a replicable model that solves multiple urban problems simultaneously, the British Development Minister had said during our initial meetings. It's precisely what we've been searching for. With success came the opportunity, and responsibility, to give back. The Hamilton Foundation, launched on the 3rd anniversary of my company, focused specifically on helping women escape financially abusive relationships. We provided emergency housing, legal assistance, job training, and seed funding for women starting businesses after leaving controlling partners. Financial independence is the key, I explained during the Foundation's launch event. When you control your own resources, you control your choices. The mentorship program I established for young women in business and design became one of my greatest joys. Twice monthly, I hosted informal dinners where early career women could ask questions, share challenges, and build networks in a supportive environment. I wish I'd had something like this when I was starting out, I told Caitlin, who had become the Foundation's executive director after years of nonprofit experience. Someone to say that ambition isn't unfeminine, that assertiveness isn't aggression, that competence doesn't need to be softened with self-deprecation. You're building the support system you needed, she replied. That's true leadership. My personal healing journey paralleled my professional growth. The panic attacks that had plagued me during the early months after leaving James gradually subsided. The recurring nightmare of being locked out of our home with no resources finally stopped. I began trusting my instincts again, in business decisions, in relationships, in life choices. My relationship with Aaron deepened as I worked through the trauma of my marriage. Unlike James, who had demanded perfection and compliance, Aaron appreciated my complexity, the driven businesswoman and the occasional mess, the confident leader and the woman who sometimes still doubted herself at 3 a.m. "I love all of you," he said one evening as we walked along the Brooklyn waterfront near my apartment. "Not just the successful parts." My parents, with whom I had painfully reconnected after years of James-imposed distance, had grown to appreciate Aaron too. "He sees you," my mother observed during their first visit to New York since my divorce. "Really sees you. And he doesn't try to change you," my father added, his lingering guilt over not recognizing James' controlling nature still occasionally surfacing. "Neither do I assured them. That's the difference." As Hamilton Enterprises thrived, Hamilton Developments continued its decline. James had rejected my restructuring offer, choosing instead to fight the debt obligations through increasingly desperate legal challenges. The SEC investigation had expanded, freezing assets and forcing project suspensions. Investors fled, employees resigned, and the stock became nearly worthless. I took no pleasure in watching the company's demise, knowing how many innocent employees were affected. Through discreet channels, I had my HR team reach out to talented Hamilton Development staff, offering positions within my growing organization. Many accepted, grateful for the lifeline and often commenting on the stark contrast in company cultures. "It's like going from a toxic family to a healthy one," one project manager told me after joining Hamilton Enterprises. "I didn't realize how dysfunctional things were until I left." The final act in Hamilton Development's collapse came suddenly, though not unexpectedly. After months of legal maneuvering, James filed for bankruptcy protection, both for the company and personally. The news dominated industry publications and even made the front page of the Wall Street Journal. "Hamilton Empire crumbles, Development Dynasty declares bankruptcy." That same day, I signed the final papers making me CEO of Hamilton Enterprises following our corporate restructuring. The timing was coincidental but symbolically perfect. As one Hamilton empire fell, another reached new heights. I learned about James' personal bankruptcy from my lawyers, who had been monitoring the proceedings to protect our interests as creditors. The filing revealed the extent of his desperation. He had mortgaged family properties, liquidated inheritance assets, even borrowed against his life insurance policy in failed attempts to save the company. His family's social standing collapsed along with their financial empire. Country club memberships were quietly relinquished. The Hamptons estate was listed for sale. Their names disappeared from charity gala attendance lists and museum donor walls. The old money network that had once insulated them from consequences had finally withdrawn its protection in the face of undeniable misconduct. Throughout all of this, I maintained a dignified silence publicly. When reporters asked for comments on Hamilton Development's troubles, I offered only generic statements about industry challenges. When former social connections attempted to extract gossip about James, I changed the subject. Revenge fantasies had fueled my early determination, but success had rendered them unnecessary. Instead, I channeled my energy into creating something James could never have envisioned, a company where profit and purpose coexisted harmoniously, where employees felt valued rather than exploited, where communities benefited rather than being displaced. On a personal level, I worked to rebuild relationships damaged during my marriage. My parents visited regularly, marveling at the life I'd created. Old friends like Caitlin became integral parts of my support system again. Even my relationship with my younger sister, which had virtually disappeared during my marriage due to James' subtle undermining, was slowly healing. "I always knew you were too strong to stay in that situation forever," she told me during a weekend visit. "But I didn't know how to reach you when you were with him." "He was very good at isolation," I acknowledged. "Building walls around me brick by brick, so gradually I didn't notice until I was completely enclosed." The final board meeting of the fiscal year unanimously approved my appointment as CEO of the newly restructured Hamilton Enterprises, formalizing the leadership role I had effectively been filling for months. As we concluded the official business, the board chair proposed a toast. "To Rebecca," he said, raising his glass. who built something extraordinary not by following the established playbook, but by writing her own. As I looked around the boardroom at the diverse group of executives and investors who had joined my vision, many of them women who had overcome their own obstacles, I felt a profound sense of having come full circle. The corporate world that had once seemed designed to exclude people like me now had a place where we could thrive on our own terms. After the meeting, I called Aaron. "It's official," I told him. "The paperwork is signed." "Congratulations, CEO," he replied warmly. "This calls for a celebration." "Actually," I said, "there's something else I want to do first." That evening, I drove to Westchester County alone, following the familiar route to the mansion that had once been my prison and my palace. It had been listed for sale months earlier, and I had quietly purchased it through a shell company, with plans to convert it into the headquarters for the Hamilton Foundation. As I pulled into the circular driveway, memories flooded back, arriving here as a new bride, hosting dinner parties where I felt like an imposter, leaving with my suitcases under James' cold gaze. But the emotional charge those memories once carried had dissipated, leaving only historical footnotes in a story that had long since moved in a different direction. I unlocked the front door with the new keys, stepping into the marble foyer where James had predicted my inevitable failure. The house stood empty, awaiting transformation. Tomorrow, architects and designers would arrive to begin converting this monument to excess into a space for healing and empowerment. But tonight, it was just me, standing alone in the echoing hallway, completing a journey that had begun in this very spot. "Full circle," I whispered to myself, my voice bouncing off marble and mahogany. But not an ending. A new beginning. The applause was deafening as I stepped onto the stage to accept the National Urban Development Innovation Award, the industry's highest honor for transformative approaches to city planning. 3 years after leaving my marriage with nothing but suitcases, I stood before a ballroom filled with the most influential figures in real estate and design, being recognized not as someone's wife, but as a visionary in my own right. "Thank you," I said as the applause finally subsided. When I founded Hamilton Designs in a friend's spare bedroom, I never imagined standing here today. But sometimes our greatest innovations are born from our deepest challenges. From my vantage point on stage, I could see the entire ballroom, including, somewhat surprisingly, James seated near the back. He had found employment with a former colleague after the bankruptcy, serving as a special advisor at a fraction of his former status and compensation. Our paths rarely crossed in professional settings anymore, making his presence here particularly unexpected. The traditional development model asks, how can we maximize profit from this property? I continued. Our approach asks different questions. How can this property serve its community? How can it foster connection rather than displacement? How can it regenerate rather than extract? As I outlined the principles that had guided Hamilton Enterprises to success, sustainability, inclusion, community ownership, I watched the audience lean forward, taking notes. What had once been considered idealistic or impractical was now being recognized as the future of urban development. This award belongs not just to me, but to every member of the Hamilton Enterprises team who had the courage to imagine a different way of building. To our investors who recognized that social impact and financial returns can coexist. To the communities who trusted us with their neighborhoods. And to everyone who believed in this vision when it was nothing more than words on paper. I concluded by announcing the Hamilton Foundation's first major initiative, a $10 million commitment to help women achieve financial independence through housing assistance, business loans, and educational opportunities. Because economic self-determination is the foundation of all other freedoms, I said, thinking of my own journey. Thank you again for this honor. The standing ovation that followed brought unexpected tears to my eyes. The professional validation was meaningful, certainly, but it was the personal journey this represented that truly moved me, from the frightened woman who had believed her husband's assessment of her worthlessness to the leader now shaping an industry. After the ceremony, well-wishers surrounded me, offering congratulations and discussing potential collaborations. I was deep in conversation with the mayor of Philadelphia about an upcoming project when I felt a tap on my shoulder. Impressive speech, James said as I turned. Very inspirational. Up close, he looked older than his 44 years. The bankruptcy and public disgrace had taken their toll, etching lines around his eyes and mouth that hadn't been there before. His custom suit, once a symbol of his success, now seemed like a costume from a former life. "Thank you," I replied neutrally. "Surprising to see you here." "Professional obligation." He gestured vaguely toward his current employer across the room. "Though I admit, I was curious to see how you'd handle the spotlight." "And your verdict?" "You've always been good at presentations." "I taught you well." The familiar attempt to claim credit for my success might once have infuriated me. Now it seemed merely pathetic. "Would you like to continue this conversation somewhere more private?" I suggested, not wanting to create a scene in front of industry peers. He followed me to a small anteroom off the main ballroom, his expression shifting from public charm to something harder once we were alone. "You've done well for yourself," he acknowledged. "Using my name, my connections, my business model." "Your name, perhaps," I conceded. "But my business model is precisely the opposite of yours, James. That's why mine is thriving while yours collapsed." "Market conditions were the same for both of us," I interrupted. "The difference was values. You built on exploitation, I built on collaboration. You extracted, I invested. You focused on appearance, I focused on substance." His jaw tightened. "You sound like you're taking credit for my downfall." "No," I said honestly. "You accomplished that entirely on your own. I just refused to go down with you." James stared at me for a long moment. "What did I do that was so terrible, Rebecca?" "I gave you a beautiful home, introduced you to important people, brought you into a world you could never have accessed on your own. While systematically undermining my confidence, isolating me from anyone who cared about me, controlling every aspect of my life, and cheating on me," I added. "The mansion was a beautiful cage, James. Nothing more. And now you own it," he said, his tone bitter. "I heard you bought the house." "Yes. It's being converted into headquarters for the Hamilton Foundation. Women in abusive relationships will find support there, ironically in the same spaces where I lost myself." "Poetic justice?" he sneered. "No. Just repurposing something beautiful that was used for harm into something that heals." I reached into my clutch and removed the platinum credit card he had waved at me the day I left, the one I had kept as a reminder during my darkest moments. "I've been carrying this. I don't need it anymore." James looked at the card, then back at me. "You kept this for 3 years? That's disturbing." "It was motivation," I corrected him. "Every time I doubted myself, I remembered you waving this, telling me I'd be crawling back within 6 months." He took the card, turning it over in his fingers. "And now you're throwing your success in my face." "No, James. I'm returning something that doesn't belong to me. What happens next is up to you." As I turned to leave, he called after me, "I did love you, you know. In my way." I paused at the door. "I know. But your way of loving required my diminishment. Real love lifts people up, it doesn't tear them down." Back in the ballroom, Aaron was waiting, his quiet pride more meaningful than all the industry accolades. "Everything okay?" he asked, nodding toward the anteroom where James still stood, watching us. "Yes," I said, realizing it was completely true. "Everything is perfect." Later that evening, after the crowds had dispersed and the award was safely packed away, Aaron and I walked through the mansion that had once been my marital home, now in the final stages of renovation into the Hamilton Foundation headquarters. "It's strange being back here," I admitted as we toured what had been the formal living room, now transformed into a welcoming space for women seeking assistance. "But healing, too." "You've reclaimed it," Aaron observed. "Like you reclaimed your life." In what had once been James' home office, the room where I had discovered him with Melissa, construction crews had installed floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gardens, flooding the space with natural light. This would be my office now, as I divided my time between running Hamilton Enterprises and overseeing the foundation. Full circle, I murmured, running my hand along the custom desk that had replaced James' imposing mahogany monstrosity. From being told I was nothing in this house to running an empire from it. As Aaron and I finished our tour and prepared to leave, I paused in the foyer where my journey had begun 3 years earlier. The marble floors remained, but everything else had changed, the oppressive dark wallpaper replaced with warm, welcoming tones, the imposing chandelier exchanged for subtle lighting that invited rather than intimidated. "Ready?" Aaron asked, holding out his hand. I took one last look around, at the space that had witnessed both my lowest moment and now my triumph. The fear and insecurity that had once defined me here had been replaced by confidence and purpose. The woman who had left with suitcases had returned as a leader, transforming a symbol of her oppression into a beacon of hope for others. "Yes," I said, taking his hand. "I'm ready." As we stepped outside into the cool evening air, I felt the final weight of the past lift from my shoulders. James had been wrong about me, about my capabilities, my resilience, my worth. The empire I had built wasn't defined by revenge or competition with him, but by creating something that reflected my own values and vision. The ultimate victory wasn't in his defeat, but in my liberation from needing either his validation or his failure to define my success. I had truly come full circle, returning not to where I started, but to who I had always been beneath the layers of doubt he had cultivated. It's incredible how someone's worst prediction about you can become the very thing that drives your greatest achievement. If you've ever transformed pain into power, I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. Subscribe if you want more real-life turnaround stories, and share this with someone who might need to believe in their own comeback. Remember, the people who say you can't are usually just afraid of what happens when you do. Thank you for witnessing my journey from betrayal to building an empire, and I'll see you in the next video.